Good morning, everyone. Good evening, depending on what time zone you're in. I'm so delighted that you're joining us today. I'm Gayatri Gopinath. I'm the director of the Center for the Studies of Gender and Sexuality here at NYU. Welcome to the panel, Crisis, Ordinariness, Lauren Berlant's Cruel Optimism in a Transnational Frame. So this is actually the final panel of the semester in an ongoing webinar series that we at CSGS at NYU have been hosting in collaboration with the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality at Ashoka University in New Delhi. And that's a center that's directed by Professor Madhavi Menon. So the series, entitled Theory and Practice, places scholars in the US and South Asia, as well as other global sites in conversation to engage in a truly transnational dialogue in feminist and queer studies. So please do check out our previous webinars in the series. They're online at our website at CSGS NYU, as well as CSGS Ashoka. So just to give this panel a little bit of framing, as many of you know, this is the 10th anniversary of the publication of Lauren Berlant's groundbreaking monograph, Cruel Optimism. And it's actually just a few months after Berlant's own untimely passing in the summer of this year. So we mean the panel to be both a celebration and an honoring of Berlant's book, which gives us a thick description of the neoliberal present and its affective modes: anxiety, precarity, insecurity, exhaustion, spacing out. So for Berlant, the so-called good life represents the deadening strictures of normativity that are further and further out of reach, an assimilation that is forever over the rainbow, as she puts it. We specifically wanted to stage a conversation between scholars from very different geographic and political vantage points: India, the US-Mexico border, and Hong Kong, in order to reflect on how Berlant's trenchant critique of psychic enactments or attachments in the context of the ordinariness of crisis resonate today both within and beyond the borders of the US. So what happens when we wrest Berlant's notions of cruel optimism and the good life and her analysis of the exhaustion of life under late capitalism outside a Euro-American frame? What emerges in these other sites? So I can think of no better scholars to help us think through these questions than the ones we have with us today. So I'm going to very briefly introduce our panelists. You can find their full bios on our website as well as in the chat. So our first speaker is Brenda Bose, who teaches at the Center for English Studies at JNU in New Delhi. Her interests are in gender and sexualities, modernist and avant-garde literatures, and film studies. Her monograph, The Audacity of Pleasure, Sexualities, Literature, and Cinema in India, was published in 2017, and her edited collection, Humanities Provocateur, Towards a Contemporary Political Aesthetics, came out in July of this year. She's also the author of a chapbook of poems that came out last year entitled Calcutta, Crow, and Other Fragments. Our next speaker is Maria Josefina Saldana Portillo, who is a professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at NYU. She is the author of 2 prize-winning monographs, most recently Indian Given, Racial Geographies Across Mexico and the United States, published by Duke in 2016, and The Revolutionary Imagination in the Americas and the Age of Development, also from Duke in 2003. She's also the author of over 30 articles on revolution, subaltern politics, indigenous peoples, racial formation, and migration to the US. And finally, we have Alvin K. Wong, who is assistant professor in comparative literature at the University of Hong Kong. His research and teaching interests include Hong Kong culture, Chinese cultural studies, Sinophone studies, transnational feminism, and queer theory. Alvin is writing a book entitled Queer Hong Kong as Method, and he has published in numerous journals and edited volumes and co-edited the volume Keywords in Queer Sinophone Studies, which was published by Routledge in 2020. So just to give you a sense of how this event will go, it will last 1 hour, and we'll begin with opening statements from each of the panelists lasting from about 8 to 10 minutes. I'll then moderate a discussion between our three panelists for the next 15 minutes or so. And the last 15 minutes will be devoted to questions from you, the audience. And so we absolutely want to hear from you. So at any point during the panelists' talks, please submit your questions in the Q&A function rather than in the chat. So your questions, the audience questions, will be fielded by Shreyashi Sharma from CSGS Ashoka University. So thank you so much to Shreyashi for doing that. And I also want to thank our co-sponsor, the Asian Pacific American Institute at NYU. So warm welcome to Brenda, Josie, and Alvin. And Brenda, we'll begin with you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gayatri, and thank you for organizing this panel. It's an honor to be here. It's a mourning and a celebration together for Berlant's passing and the 10-year mark for a very significant book. So I think it's ironically Cruel Optimism in a way. For me, Cruel Optimism has spoken most insistently through Berlant's expositions on the aesthetic and the political. In fact, the aesthetic as political, in an enjambment of crisis, ordinariness. This enjambment has escalated in India since the 1990s, corresponding with economic liberalization, and with extreme ferocity over the past 7 years, the right-wing government and its stooges in our public institutions tightening the noose, and the liberal left thrashing around in distress and a nostalgic moral grandstanding of its own. And indeed, the sense of looming terror has been exacerbated in the past 2 years, of course, over the pandemic. What price fantasies of good life, then, we might ask, and is there now only phantasmatic loss? And yet, while trauma and affect studies have swept through our universities, I have tended to read Cruel Optimism against the wave of trauma and hurt sentiments that it almost exclusively seems to be read, because I've always thought that the book is far more complex and than that. That Berlant was a scholar of literature is often almost overlooked in drawing on their work. But nowhere is that deep love and engagement in the aesthetics of words, sounds, and visual texts more clearly evidenced than in this book, both richly evocative and sharply political. The work is capacious, of course, and has something for everyone, but it does not speak to me as one that valorizes art as mourning and memorialization alone. Rather, it fashions aesthetics as a chiseled political intervention that becomes, to use Berlant's terms, glitch and impasse in crises of the ordinary. Instead of recording or representing crises in various modes of complaint or sadness or silence, I will speak from my location in India about how Berlant's queering of that pitch, as I see it, has led me to think about new genres and emergent aesthetics, again, the two terms that they have used often in the book, locally, always becoming rather than being. I'll just have Robert has offered very kindly to play a few slides that will provide some basic context for the text that I will quickly walk through. Cruel Optimism, to me, is a vast and intricately argued philosophical rumination on political aesthetics, as I said. What I've highlighted here in red particularly is Berlant's premise that it is not the trauma caused by crises, but the changes forced by crises and by crisis ordinariness that are to be studied in the forms they take to mediate them. So the gesture is a potential event, but the present is a stretch of time that is resistant. An impasse experienced in transitions and transactions. And I think those two words are very, very important. Berlant's deep curiosity about how aesthetic forms respond to times of crises suggests to me that it is their way to map complexities of social, political, philosophical, psychological, and cultural negotiations, detouring, though, very, very definitively through the creative and the imaginative, attracted by transgressions and dissensions. In and of itself, this method of conceptualizing affect through a political and philosophical inquiry into the aesthetics of new genres, for me, is a difficult queer method of understanding a time and its crises of the ordinary. The next slide, please. I'll just run through a few texts from various genres that have spoken to me through this book. Dilip Chitre, bilingual poet and critic in Marathi and English, had the pulse of many in post-independence India. In what I see as a Berlantian gesture, he turns in the lines that I've highlighted toward the solider object of surviving feeling, relying on the image and the double-crossing metaphor to slay the mood. Feeling is capitalized, personified, and the poet must survive it, or it may smother him. Such has been this long durée of reckoning. The poets know the variations of which Berlant writes. People are destroyed in it, or discouraged but maintaining, or happily managing things, or playful and enthralled. This is in Cruel Optimism, page 200. The poem mounts an impasse to wallowing in feeling, who may be the enemy. The next slide, please. Berlant has talked at length of the novel form in literature and its contortions to capture contemporary crises. Arundhati Roy's second novel, published in 2017, which I have called elsewhere an anti-novel, deriving from Nicanor Parra's idea of anti-poetry, revolted against its lineages of the Indian English novel to tell a shattered story in broken and scattered form. In moving from slowly becoming everybody to slowly becoming everything, Roy draws attention to processes of transformation and mutation, breaking up narratives to mimic shattered lives and artifacts. Roy has talked of her novel as layered, a word that Berlant also uses in the book when talking of Greg Portowitz's film of 2001, Habit, a work that Berlant says enables him to understand his own historical present through the protagonist's own senses, through the reported stories of others, through a multitude of sonic layerings. Roy's two protagonists in The Ministry, the transgender Hijra character Anjum, formerly Aftab, and Tilo, who has eyes like broken glass, offer a multitude of visual layerings of landscape and people in a space where urgencies of livelihood are worked out all over again, to use Berlant's words, without assurances of futurity, but nevertheless proceeding via durable norms of adaptation. And I think this works really well for what Roy does with her novel. The next slide, please. Amis Ravening is a 2019 film from the state of Assam in the northeast of India, a region that is known to enjoy its meats as much as the north of the country generally shuns it. It is a film that moves rapidly from being about a couple's pleasure in meat eating, in food, to being about devouring each other, literally, erotically, transforming what I think into what Berlant calls a glitch, an interruption in a transition which has an impasse, no longer an aberration and a holdup merely, but a short-circuiting of desire in Deleuzian terms. Crisis Ordinariness encounters crisis extraordinaire. Here is a brave new and shocking new genre and a film that may well brew an emergent aesthetics, not for its horrors of flesh eating alone, but for the quiet, resolute fortitude with which the couple own their dissolute desires and are ready to pay for them with their lives. A cinema of erotic cannibalism becomes the glitch in a long lineage of the cinema of precarity. The next slide, please. Shomnath Hoare, artist from Bengal who just marked his birth centenary this year, offers an opportunity of seeing the wound as a living, wounding symbol of impasse in crisis ordinariness. From the 1970s, Hoare produced a series of paper pulp prints, which he gouged out, sometimes staining it with bits of red and brown, to create visual, tactile impressions of woundings that embody a minimalist aesthetics at distinct odds with the victim's large pain, constituting, again, I think what Berlant might have called a disturbance in the situation of the present and the adaptations improvised around it. We see how a tactile aesthetics contends with the contingency of bruising, again, a term that Berlant uses, turning itself into a bruise one can both see and touch. The next slide, please. I will end with Anish Kapoor exhibiting this year at Oxford his bludgeoning new work constituted of enormous and engulfing wounds, the exposing of human entrails and genitalia, blood-soaked, blood-coagulated, blood-congealed. He stands perhaps at the opposite end of the spectrum from Somnath Hore's minimalism, yet both sets of art equally are shocking and wrenching. Together then, through more than 50 years, this random selection is a historical and political testament to an aesthetics that can imaginatively transform into an impasse or a glitch for crisis ordinariness that speak to one another and us, locally as well as transnationally, that resist all norms and ethics of genteel squeamishness by disturbing and enthralling, that layer its text like a palimpsest of innocence and experience that no longer merely captures the impasse of the transitional moment, but becomes that very impasse. I suggest that in a queer mode of transitioning, the texts metamorphose into the context of their being, caught in their moments of becoming. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Brenda. That was so rich. So let's move on to Alvin.
Okay. And I will try sharing my screen here. It's working, the screen. So I want to thank Gayatri for this kind invitation, and also for NYU and Ashoka Universities for this really important event that also helps me think about, to reflect on Berlant's really important and a few changing book, Cruel Optimism, and particularly to think about it at this moment in relationship to Hong Kong and queer theory and affect. So in Cruel Optimism, Lauren Berlant offers a transformative analysis of late capitalism, affects, and modes of attachments that resonates with many issues of our time. The rise of conservatism and populism in the US, China, Europe, the COVID-19 pandemic, environmental crisis, and ongoing military occupations, and the presence of US empire in places like Japan, South Korea, Israel, Palestine, make the fantasy of the good life all the more unreachable for the large sectors of the world. Berlant writes that, quotes, the affective structure of an optimistic attachment involves a sustaining inclination to return to the scene of fantasy that enables you to expect that this time, nearness to this thing will help you or a world to become different in just the right way, end quotes. In my brief comments today, I turn to everyday scene of ordinary violence, ongoing forms of affective attachments, and queer visual arts to suggest some ways to think the political alongside queer desire and affects. To dissect the ongoing scenes of ordinary crisis in Hong Kong, it might be useful to situate Hong Kong with a broader genealogy. I'm writing at a moment when Hong Kong has just surpassed the 2-year anniversary of the Anti-Extradition Law Amendment Bill movement, shorthand anti-ELAP. The anti-ELAP movement refers to a mass social movement aimed at overturning an extradition bill that the chief executive, Carrie Lam, introduced in February 2019. This bill, if passed successfully, would extradite serious crime offenders to mainland China, but carry with it disastrous consequences and erosion of democratic freedom. Since June 30th, 2020, the PRC, People Republic of China, and Hong Kong also passed a new national security law, which aims to ensure national security for Hong Kong's post-colonial governance and economic prosperity. In the months after the passage of the law, pro-democratic politicians like Joshua Wong, who participated at the annual June 4th Tiananmen Square vigil, have been sentenced to jail. A major anti-establishment newspaper, Apple Daily, was forced to shut down, and you see the last day of printing of the newspaper and people lining up the last day to purchase the newspaper. And a few professors who are active in the local social movements could not, either was sacked or they did not get their contract renewed, or basically didn't get tenure. So while the 2019 protests captivated global attention due to the powerful movement that erupted in the summer, it also brought millions of Hong Kong people to the street to voice their opposition to the extradition bill. June 9th, 2019 brought more than 1 million peaceful protesters to the street, while June 16, 2019 resulted in yet another peaceful march number at about 2 million people. The subsequent escalation of violence from both the police and the protester sides have resulted in serious mistrust between Hong Kong people, the government, and the police. So to show how crisis is mediated as scenes of ordinary ongoing violence in Hong Kong, I'd like to briefly turn to the treatment of Southeast Asian domestic workers at the outbreak of the pandemic in 2020. The outsourcing and transfer of care work globally refers to what Richelle Puranas terms the international division of reproductive labor, where middle-class and economically privileged women purchase the domestic services of Filipino domestic workers and other workers from Southeast Asia, who often in turn purchase the domestic work provided by subaltern women back home who are too economically disenfranchised to move globally. Currently, there are more than 400,000 domestic workers from the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, and Sri Lanka who are working in Hong Kong. Many who left Hong Kong for their annual visit back home in the Philippines found it impossible to return to Hong Kong for work during February 20th, 2020, when the government imposed travel ban. For those who continue working in Hong Kong, school suspension in early February 2020 for both K-12 and college students means that the domestic space is suddenly more crowded than usual. On the top of performing the usual domestic tasks, many foreign domestic maids found their employer to be emotionally unstable, extremely demanding, and increasingly regulatory over their behaviors. Many domestic workers are discouraged to take their only day off in the week on Sunday due to the fear by employers that their live-in might bring contagions from outside. So here you see actually the police monitoring their gatherings usually on Sunday, and also the kind of pictures that usually circulates in the media. The normality and sanctity of the domestic sphere is heavily guarded through the logic of policing imaginary threats from the outside. The racialization and gendering of domestic workers as outsiders whose hygiene, and not to mention sexual practices and queer desire, must be constantly monitored, is of course fraught through with contradictions in racial and sexual terms. One domestic workers anonymized as Lovsky remarks on the racialized economy of risk and the extreme burden of work during the pandemic. There are just too many people in the small space. They get upset over little things like how much bleach to use and how many times surfaces should be wiped down. A friend joked on WhatsApp's, a social network apps on phone, that she died from the smell of chlorine before the virus kills her. So I have sketched so far scenes of the contemporary social reproduction in Hong Kong as one of crisis embedded in ordinariness, and how narratives of good life remain out of reach for the majority of folks on the social margin. In my closing remarks, I like to invoke the possibility of seeing Hong Kong queerly from the visual optic of what Gayatri Gopinath terms unruly visions. So in Unruly Visions, Gopinath defines queerness as a mode of reading queer desire and intimacies across multiple racial formations, bodies of knowledge, geographies, and temporalities through a particular South-South regional imaginary. Gopinath writes, quotes, "This queer optic reanimates the non-normative desires, practices, embodiments, and affiliations that can be gleaned from the past. It brings them into the present in order to envision other possibilities of social life." So, and in January to February 2021, so this is just 6 months after the passage of the National Security Law, a queer art exhibition entitled Unruly Visions was held in WMA Space in Central in the financial district on Hong Kong Island. The exhibition was inspired by the works of queer theorists such as Jose Munoz and Gayatri Gopinath, curated by visual artist, but also academic, De Gaman. It features the works of 9 emerging LGBT visual artists in Hong Kong. The editorial statement frames the aim of the exhibition boldly, quotes, "Unruly Visions for our exhibition is a queer proposition to dissent and disrupt, to reframe, to question how we see and what we know." Well, one photograph from the series The Couple by the visual artist from Ming depicts a queer lesbian couple enjoying themselves and sitting on a bench in an urban landscape. Other works, such as Dancer and Reader by Y.W. Guan, feature queer bodies in Hong Kong that disrupts the mundane urban space with queer gestures and bodily stillness. So, and the one on the right is literally standing in the middle of the tunnel. And Nelson Tan Chapman, a former student journalist who was arrested by the police during one illegal assembly, produces a series called Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been? Which features a transgender subject looking back at a young man that looks like a protester with a mask. Tan's photograph invites the viewer to ponder at the possibility that queer subjects are also participants in the 2019 social movement, and also to rethink the relationship between queer desire, social movement, and the historical presence. So that's all I have for today, and I really look forward to the conversation later on.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Alvin. What a pleasure to hear your thoughts. Josie, we'll turn it over to you now. You're muted, Josie.
Really? Still after all this time, you start talking and you're muted. So we were asked to think about Cruel Optimism, Lauren Berlant's book, within the context of our work and the context of worlds other than the US and Europe. And there is indeed a lot of friction in Lauren Berlant's theory of cruel optimism, a lot of friction between her construction of cruel optimism and its impact, or how it could be applied, or how we could read the first world, third world divide through it. And I'm going to speak as Brenda and Alvin already have so brilliantly spoken to the incongruity of the concept of a situation tragedy or a good life within the Latin American context, especially through the filter of the migration crisis that, that the crisis that actually has become just simply a way for Latin America to deal with the ongoing, I wouldn't say crisis ordinary, because none of these crises are ordinary, even if, because an ordinary crisis implies that there's nothing we could do to fix it, right? In my view, it implies like there's no change we could make. And in my view, there's always changes that could be made. So I was very drawn by this definition that she gives in this quote, in the situation tragedy, the subject's world is fragile beyond repair, one gesture away from losing all access to sustaining its fantasies. The situation threatens utter abject unraveling. And again, I was thinking, is this situation tragedy, how would I think about it within the context of Central America, for example? And I think it's actually more, or Southern Mexico, it's more a tragedy that's situational. The subject is beyond any sustaining fantasies, except perhaps the fantasy of sustaining life. Because, so, that leads us to say, well, what is a good life? Berlant talks about bad luck, as something that as she puts it in her book, bad luck as something that happens to interrupt the fantasy of the good life. But what happens when bad luck is precisely by design, right? I mean, I'm not suggesting that Berlant isn't aware of all of these things, but when you think about this within within Latin America anyway, it has a very different connotation, right? The situation as the tragedy as situational is precisely brought in by the ongoing neocolonial extraction that happens within Latin America, coupled with climate change, right? The ongoing genocide of indigenous peoples, in large part to dispossess them of territories that have minerals that are necessary for our cell phones, for the batteries that are going to be used for storing wind energy and solar energy. All of these things make the crisis of neoliberalism seem almost quaint, right? The crisis of the neoliberal structural adjustments that were imposed upon Mexico, Central America, Chile, that makes that seem almost, or I suppose it has become ordinary, right? The crisis of neoliberalism. But again, it's where you can see governments like Mexico's government, like recently banning GMO corn and banning glyphosate, right? So fertilizers and pesticides that are deadly and that have been banned in the United States. This you can address neoliberalism, right? Addressing climate change, addressing the constant need for the extraction of materials that actually enable our good life. How do we address that, right? How do we address that in a way that is kind of in my view a little bit beyond fantasies of the good life in the US, right? It exceeds that. So I also was thinking, like, what would be a fantasy of a good life in the case of Latin America? And I was like, oh, well, we had a big fantasy of a good life for about 50 years, and it was revolutionary movements. And again, what hammer was brought down on that revolutionary movement? It was the hammer of US backed counterinsurgency campaigns, because of the need for the goods that are produced in these areas, right? I do believe that, of course, racism plays a huge part in genocide, but it's the fact that indigenous peoples are sitting on this biodiversity that's, they have territorial control of areas of biodiversity that houses resources that transnational corporations still need to get a hold of. So I was like, there was this collective fantasy of a good life, and it was replaced by migration, right, and fleeing from these crises. I'm not even talking about the drug war, which is what brings asylum seekers to our borders most recently, right? The violence again that shows the interrelatedness of the war, right? As it's our drug consumption that sustains a very gendered violence, in Central America by the MS-13 and Barrio 18 in Mexico by the Zetas, the Sinaloa cartel. This violence is always necessary for the extraction and production and distribution of these resources that we consume, that makes our good life, possible. I wanted to just end, if I can share my screen, with this. Let me see if I can go. How do I do it? I start the slideshow, right? I want to do that. How do I do that? Can somebody help me do that? Because I was really amazed.
It's at the bottom of the screen.
It's at the bottom of the screen.
Yeah, your slideshow, bottom right-hand side.
Again, how have I not learned this by now? But I haven't.
Yep, you're going in the right direction. Down to the right.
Okay.
A little to the left. There you go. A little more to the. Keep going to the right. Keep going
to the right. There. No.
No. Keep going to the right.
Okay.
There you go. You got it.
No, now I've gone away entirely. Can you see my slide?
Yeah, there you go. You got it.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, I can't see my slide, so I'm not going to do the full screen. I apologize. But I was very taken by these murals that were part of the Los Angeles Latin America exhibition that happened 2 years ago, sponsored by Pacific Standard Time and the Guggenheim. And here we have, these are Zapotec artists, the Tlacolulocos from Tlacolula, Oaxaca, who were invited by the Zapotec population in Los Angeles to participate and to bring these murals. And I was very struck by the fact that the fantasy of the good life for these indigenous migrants who come to the United States is the fantasy of achieving the marginal status that Chicanos have, right? And I love this mixture of the aesthetics that we see here of the kind of traditional indigenous trajes, the jewelry, even the grecas that one would find on the in the ruins in the indigenous ruins in Oaxaca, right, onto their faces, this tattooing. This is not, tattooing isn't part of indigenous cultural expression in Latin America, but in Oaxaca anyway. But because of this kind of migration and the I suppose I would say transculturation or transnationalization of Chicano culture, it was just interesting to me that the fantasy of a good life, and this has been true always for Central Americans, right, is can we achieve the status of the marginalized minority in the United States? Because that would be a good life in comparison with the constant exposure to death and gendered violence. That's as I said, tragedy is situational, right? It's the necessary violence for the production of what sustains our good life. So that I'd want to stop. Let me stop the share. I don't know what. Okay.
Thank you so much, Josie.
And now my camera has gone out somehow. Sorry.
It's okay. So let's engage in a discussion here between the three of you. I found all of your presentations so incredibly rich and engaging. And one of the things that struck me is how all of you go to the aesthetic, right? And so this is exactly what Brenda was sort of thematizing for us, as she puts it, the aesthetics of new genres, and sort of forcing us to really pay attention to Berlant's, focus on genre and form. And it strikes me, in all your presentations, as I said, the aesthetic becomes precisely that space of the glitch, the impasse. So this to me, and, Josie sort of mentioned this in Josie, in your initial comments where you said you don't like the notion of crisis ordinariness because it gives a sense of no possibility. And, this is something I was really thinking about listening to all of you is, where's the sense of possibility, transformation, change, alternatives in Berlant's text, And I think all of you are kind of speaking to that in the way in which you're reading the aesthetic. So I'm wondering if we can talk about that, because, just to give you a sense, my initial entry into Berlant's text was reading it with Jose Munoz in a graduate seminar that we taught together called The Good Life. And so we read Lauren's book with Jose's Cruising Utopia. So I was very glad that Alvin, you sort of brought Jose Munoz's work into the mix, because putting those two texts in conversation, I think we all in that class were really struck by, where is the space of possibility in Berlant's text? Where do we encounter that? And for Munoz, it's very clear. It's precisely in the space of the aesthetic, and it's in queer relationality and notions of queer affiliation. So maybe we can just sort of start with that. Brenda, do you have any thoughts on that? Because I think you're really giving us that in the ways in which you laid out these different genres for us.
Yeah, I was, I've been struck by the fact that over and over, now that I was going back, I went back to the book and I was reading it more carefully, that there are all these terms that Berlant uses along with aesthetics, aesthetics of disturbance, aesthetics of the ordinary, how one has to, he says they say somewhere, to interfere with the work of trauma means to refuse its temporality, its insistence on saturating the present. So there's always this sense, I think, of combating the present in its, even as it is, flowing past one, that there's a sense of resistance, which I think comes clearly in their readings of so many texts, films and literary texts, etc. So I think that it's, the fantasy is apparently the good life, but the good life is not the good life in the way that the term appears, right? That the good life itself is a recognition of all these complexities, and the fact that there has to be these, these constant kind of resistances and ways of looking and reading and watching and being. So the present is also not a moment; it's an impasse, as you said, and sometimes it becomes a glitch. But the glitch is what causes disturbance, and then there is this sense that can you move out of it, and can there be something beyond it? Beyond is a word that Berlant uses a lot. So and the other text, other than I've thought of in conjunction with Berlant is Halberstam's Queer Art of Failure. So again, the idea that failure itself, can be an art, and there can be a queer art of failure. Again, I think goes back to interrogating the idea of, what does good life mean for aesthetics? It clearly doesn't mean everything works and everything is pretty. So so the questioning and the constant kind of conversational dialogic mode in reading aesthetics is something that, and I think disturbance, glitch, impasse, these are the words that keep coming back. So I find those far more fruitful than sort of mourning what we know we have lost or we don't have.
Absolutely, thank you. Alvin, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so I think the question that Josie raised, and also Gayatri was just talking about teaching Berlant alongside Munoz. And I also felt when I was reading Cruel Optimism that a lot of the examples are still fairly US-centric, or when sometimes in the novels, when they talk about African-American urban poor robbing the house of the white middle-class lady, but then they could not actually deal with the kind of money that they get because they are not used to the normativity of the good life that white middle-class Americans always enjoy. So there is, I think there is some kind of discourse about exceptionalism and certain racial categories that are reinforced. But what I thought was interesting, that was helpful for me was she was also, as Brenda was talking about, trying to move beyond trauma, because that's the kind of, that's the sort of Kathy Carruth one school of theory that talks about historical injustice and so on and so forth. And I also think she might be, that they might be trying to queer the binary of the Foucauldian biopolitics, which is about the management of life, which has a certain historical sort of trajectory, versus Mbembe necropolitics, and trying to think about the present and the ordinary as an impasse that reproduces various forms of violence. And what I thought the aesthetic can do, or in a place like Hong Kong, which if we talk about late capitalism, Hong Kong is actually probably the most violent space of late capitalism. It's a place where runaway capitals are always that always in here in Hong Kong. It's also one of the cities that has the highest real estate markets in the world. So the ordinariness or the impasse or the norms of neoliberalism might be unpacked through, recently I've been looking a lot at queer migrants documentary. And today I actually just taught a film called Sunday Beauty Queens, made by Filipino queer filmmaker Ruth Villamira. And it's about the beauty pageants, but it's seen through the lens of a tomboy figure who, beside working for 6 days a week, still organize the beauty pageant. So I think it's about it's about working through the ordinariness. It's actually about working through the kind of exceptional violence and exceptional racialization, sort of exception to neoliberalism that sort of Iowa talks about, and how racialized and queer subjects work through these either ordinary or exceptional modes of violence, and how they create aesthetic work in film and literature that reckoned with this history of violence.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Alvin. Josie, do you want to add anything? Oh, you.
Yes. Well, I would say that I suppose that her theory really works so well for capturing the moment of the present, right, that we are living in, the end of this optimism, that its expression is white supremacy. So if we could understand or the cruel optimism as precisely, or white supremacy as precisely the expression of the end of that optimism, right, or when that optimism is challenged, that can be very useful. In terms of the aesthetics, and the place of trauma, again, I feel like trauma is situational, and so in Latin America we have many theories of trauma and a lot of aesthetic production around the trauma of the dictatorships, around disappearance, around torture. I feel like putting this conversation, putting Cruel Optimism in conversation with all of the literature that came out around testimonio, which is like, how do you put into words a violence that is unspeakable? You know what I mean? That has moved beyond language, right? Or how, and you have to come to grips with that, because it's the aesthetics, and of course, these are regional. It's the aesthetics of trauma that interrupt the fantasy, right? And I think it is very necessary to interrupt the fantasy, so like everything from Little Red Schoolhouse, right, that documents, it's a diary of a survivor of the Argentine secret secret camps, and to something as recent as 2020, Jairo Bustamante's La Llorona, which rethinks the myth of La Llorona as a mother who, and it's really amazing, right? Because it's finally not this kind of misogynist rendition of La Llorona, the mother who's killed her children because she's been jilted, by her lover. And it makes La Llorona somebody who is bringing justice to the Guatemalan generals like Rios Montt, who never faced justice. And so these aesthetic forms can be resignified as a way of reminding us that of the tragedy as situational that at least in Latin America has been the reality for the majority of the 20th century, and now part of the 21st. Yeah.
Thank you, Josie. I'll just say one of the things that struck me when you were talking about the good life is that, are all forms of are all fantasies of the good life necessarily cruel optimism? Because as you said, the fantasy of revolution, right, of actual revolutionary transformation isn't necessarily cruel optimism. And so, just thinking about sort of the failures of revolution, and perhaps, that's where Brenda, focusing on the glitch, the impasse, the disturbance is actually the place where alternatives can happen, because we've seen what's happened to revolutions, right? Anyway, so let's go to the questions. Shreyashi, do you want to take them for us?
Yeah, I thank you, Professor Gayatri. Thank you, Brenda, Alvin, and Josie. This was such a rich conversation coming from non-Western, non-US, and non-European perspectives, and I think the audience quite enjoyed it. Our first question is that how does decentering the US challenge Berlant's definitions of fantasy, optimism, and cruelty, and especially with respect to your own work from India, Hong Kong, and the Latin Americas?
I mean, I kind of think that that's what they were talking about the whole time. So, but do you want to add anything, speakers?
I was just remembering that Berlant in a conversation with Jay Prosser, I think in the journal biography, said very definitively that Cruel Optimism is transnational, even though many of her, most of her references and the texts that they look at are US centric for the location that they're in, but so I think that the frames, I mean, I anyway have a problem with the recent very nativist turn in critical thinking, which says that you cannot look at let's say Indian literature through theories that are not generated in India. And I find that because I think critical thinking is something faster than that, and one can always sort of come in with other perspectives. And I'm sure that the thinkers and Berlant themselves had actually said this, that they wanted to talk across nations and hoped to be talking to people outside of the US, which the book has done, I think. But there is always this kind of looping back into a certain kind of guilt that current scholarship has generated, at least in our part of the world. I don't know whether it has done that elsewhere, but which I find very reductive and limiting, because I think one can also raise questions through frameworks that may or may not apply, as Josie was saying, or Alvin was saying, that everything will not apply, but then one can take the germ of an idea and then run with it, which I think that so many people have done with these important interventions like Berlant's book.
Absolutely.
Well, I also think it's irony, or perhaps it's like the irony of history, right? That indigenous movements in Latin America have this term, the good life, right? And it's not consumptive, right? It's actually based on, it's not a consumptive based model, and it is based on how do you maintain, natural resources, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, there's no reason to have expected Lauren Berlant to have known of this social movement, which is happening, coterminous with the writing of the book. But there is actually a non-consumptive version of the good life. It's much too complicated to go into, but there's a word for it in Aymara, there's a word for it in Nahuatl, there is this concept organizing, even though there are hundreds of indigenous peoples organizing them across the hemisphere. It's now even come into the US, right? This idea of the good life that is a non-consumptive life, which would be interesting to have perhaps another conversation about that way.
Yeah, no, that's so crucial. Yeah. Alvin, do you want to add anything?
So in terms, I was also thinking about maybe from Sinophone and Hong Kong and different sort of post-colonial sites, what the good life might mean. And then I was also thinking about, if we think about it in more concrete term, the good life narrative that might not be US-centric and white. In Hong Kong, actually, there was this good life narrative called the Four Little ideology, which emerged around the 70s when light manufacturing industry really took off, and Hong Kong slowly became the center for finance capitalism. And the Four Little ideology is that if you have a wife, if you have a car, and if you have a son, and you also have a house, then that's the good life. But that's, of course, very heteronormative, and that's something that I cannot identify with at all. And then if we also think about homonormativity and how it's or queer liberalism and how it expresses its various forms in Asia, I think in Hong Kong recently, a lot of the legal cases that came through that made victory, a lot of them are actually about attracting global talents. So there was a case for lesbian spousal visa that if you have a marital status from outside of Hong Kong, your dependents can get visa. But a lot of these cases actually reproduce a certain kind of cosmopolitans mobility that might not actually benefit the local working class or actually the local Hong Kong queer LGBT subjects. So I'm also thinking about the good life and how it has multiple iteration as it intersects with race, nationality, and global capital.
Yeah, thank you. So we're actually almost out of time, but I do want to maybe go over a few minutes, and so we can just get one more question in. Shreyashi?
Yeah, our next question is, can we think of spaces of humor as attempts at looking at alternatives to the impasse of crisis ordinariness? And can they help us rethink socially, politically, the guided good life?
Anybody want to take that?
I'll take that. There's an artist, a Chicano artist, he's called Elvis instead of Elvis, but he's an Elvis imitation. And he said one thing, and I heard it so many years ago, that was really, really made me laugh. And it's like, Chicanos don't get the blues, we get the periwinkles. And I mean, it's precisely that use of humor that makes you think like, yeah, we have it bad, but we don't have it that bad, so maybe that's a way in which humor does. I mean, if you don't laugh in the face of these violences, I mean, that's a horrible thing to say, but if you don't find a way to maintain a sense of humor in the face of this situation, tragedy as situational, it's hard to survive.
Alvin or Brenda?
Well, yes, I mean, I just agree. Of course, there's a whole lineage and tradition of satire and irony, and it's come from all the many of in India we have the regional languages, lots of nonsense verse that were making sort of ironical comments on social structures and rules, I mean, coming down ages. And now we have the memes, of course, and the turning around of children's poetry and things like that into addressing the present and We even have a chief minister in Bengal who, writes, sort of chants funny things as she addresses the crowd. And so there are all kinds of, I think, of course, most texts, even the tragic texts, always have irony and satire and just plain laughter, as Josie said, that at some point we just have to laugh at the histrionics and the sheer ridiculousness of some of the impositions, right? But yeah.
Alvin, any thoughts?
It's kind of, yeah, I think I need to think through it, but I was also thinking about that we do have a genealogy of sort of queer pleasure, and I was also thinking back to Munoz and this identification. How do minoritarian subject work through these modes of survival that is neither assimilation or very clear resistance, but actually through working through and working with existing system of power. And in terms of teaching, I've been teaching a lot of texts that work through the state of negativity of being queer racialized subjects, such as Ten-Honed film Forever Bottom. And I was and I think the students really is thinking through these issues, right? And how do we precisely to think through queer survival within the spaces of cruel optimism and all the violence that are happening in the world.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we're out of time, but I see a lot of really fascinating questions in the Q&A. So we'll be sure to send that. Shreyashi, can we send that to the panelists? Is there a way to do that?
Yeah, I think we'll have the recording so we can send that.
Okay, so we'll do that. But I just wanted to thank you, all three of you, for just your brilliant insights. I found it so rich, and I feel like we could continue talking. I'm sorry our time is so short, but thank you all so much, and take care. And thank you so much to the audience for tuning in. All right, everyone, take care.
Thank you, Gayatri. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.